somebody going to start, or should we just keep whittling on?
Yeah, well, you keep talking, so...
Right, Nick and me, shut up.
Yeah, shut up. Okay, actually, I just need to scroll much off of my notes.
Jesus, man.
Welcome to episode 31 of the Pitch Masters podcast, a podcast about music by two people who know nothing about music and another person who knows a little bit about music.
Thank you.
We're joined by Nick, who I would say knows a little about music.
Okay, thank you.
And Fran, who knows nothing.
What?
Excellent.
What, because he can play guitar?
Excellent.
Yeah. Well, we both have guitars, but...
I learned the violin when I was 6, mate.
Yeah, how's that
Mastered
treating
it
you?
completely.
Yeah, well, I sold it to someone who turned it into an electronic violin, and then never saw it again.
Wow.
But that was it.
That's because you'd already defeated the instrument, isn't it, basically?
Yeah.
You'd done so good that there was nothing left to learn.
I mean, it's...
Yeah.
Wow.
You can just
Anyway.
play it in your head.
Should we move on from that?
Yeah. So we're back again to talk about some albums. This week, or this month, we're talking about 6 different albums. These are EOB with the album Earth, The Strokes with the album The New Abnormal, Rina Sawayama with Sawayama, Fiona Apple with Fetch the Bolt Cutters, and then we have a classic album, Yoko Ono with Plastic Ono Band, and then I'll be telling you why I love Jay-Z, and we're specifically going to be talking about the album The Blueprint. And so, as always, we're going to start with some esoteric questions, and the first one is I'm going to throw at Nick is, what album would your teenage self be most into?
Not that it was a boring question, but I actually dozed off in the process of you talking then. I nearly forgot to respond when you said that. So, sorry. I don't want to be rude or anything.
I have a very soothing
I mean,
voice.
that was ruder than just answering the question and not telling him that you almost dozed off. So you say you didn't want to be rude, but you were just rude.
That is true, I do. I apologise. So this was a really difficult question I found because when I was a teenager, I was basically into metal and or grunge, and hardcore and stuff. So I didn't really find any of these fit the bill at all. If I had to push myself, I suppose I'd go with Fiona Apple, Fetch the Bolt Cutters. This album was a real grower for me. It took quite a while though for me to get into it. I know it's been massively acclaimed across the board from everyone and their mum. But I think it is worth the time once you get through the initial sort of first few listens, and I'll explain about what the problem is in a minute. But first of all, I'll say the great thing is the absolutely immense lyricism. I mean, it's just a fantastic lyrical basis for all the tracks. Very elemental, I would say. Very kind of like a basic discourse, but really, really profound and moving and personal. And I mean... there's so many things you could quote from me. I'll quote from Fetch the Bolt Cutters. I grew up with the shoes they told me I could fill. When they came round, I would stand real still. A girl can roll her eyes at me and kill. I got the idea I wasn't real. I thought being backlisted would be grist for the mill. I mean, it's really, really profound, but it's such a simple, basic discourse, as I say. So I absolutely love that, and that's consistent all the way through the album. It's very, very strong. The production is often very... kind of small scale, which I find kind of interesting as well. And in that sense, I suppose if you listen to my late teens, I suppose I was into like lo-fi and stuff. The small production would kind of fit. But the one thing that didn't really work brilliantly for me was I found it quite percussively awkward and stilted in quite a lot of cases. Particularly the opening couple of songs, 2 or 3 songs, where I felt like it was really jarringly. Broken down the way the beats sort of worked and the drums and those elements worked through the songs. So I found it, I mean, I'm not against that in principle, but I found it to the point where it was distracting me from the lyrics, which is a pity because the lyrics are so good. So I'll say more about it in a minute, but because there's another album that I think it kind of really interestingly mirrors, but we'll talk about that one later on. So basically I would say definitely not a 10, which is what Pitchfork gave it, wasn't it? But really, really good. Definitely no surprise it's done so well. And yeah, I'll definitely go back to it.
Cool. Go on, Fran. What do you reckon?
Okay, well, you ended by talking about the Pitchfork score, that's where I wanted to start, really. kind of wanted to address, they gave it a 10 out of 10, perfect score. And that's why I chose it for this playlist, really, because it's not often you see that. And it's really interesting for me that this got a perfect score, because for me, the thing that makes it so fascinating and involving is how imperfect it is as an album. So I've always kind of thought of Fiona Apple, when I've heard before, as like decent, enjoyable music, but quite polished and slick. And therefore, for me, quite often it's felt a bit soulless, really. While this album feels like something that's kind of just a bit thrown out there. It's very warts and all in the lyrics, and it felt like some of what Nick was just saying, like the instrumentation is quite thrown together. But I think it's so much better than her previous work for this. I think it's such a raw, powerful piece of work. I think her lyrics and delivery throughout are just so emotive. And I know it's been released during lockdown. I don't think it was recorded during lockdown, but it feels like a lockdown album in a way. Like there's dogs barking in there, there's cats meowing, there's pots and pans being used as instrumentation, but it just all melds together really well and really interestingly. So I think it kind of creates this really open, sort of freeing vibe to the album, which I was really into. I'm not too bothered about the first track, but I think after that, the run of Shamika to Relay is really, really, really strong. And the title song in the middle of that is probably the standout of the album. And then there's Under the Table, which comes in that run as well, which I think is the song where she kind of establishes the powerful message of the album. And then I think that message is hammered home later on another song, Heavy Balloon, which is just so aggressive and angry. I really love that song. And then another thing that I loved about it really is, despite all the important messages and the feminism and the really opening up, is some of it just really sounds really fun. Songs like Cosmonaut. And then I suppose my final point is how she sometimes brings those two elements together. So the song for her is the best example. It starts with a really jaunty, sort of inviting beat. It sounds really fun. And if you're not paying attention to the word, it just sounds like an enjoyable song. And then there's the breakdown where she starts to sing about her husband raping her in the bed that her daughter was born in. I think that's just the most powerful part of the album. I think it's really well put together. So yeah, I thought this was an absolutely amazing album, but not a perfect album. But I think that's what made it so good, is that it is quite imperfect and quite messy. But I thought it was great.
So in that sense, you might give it a 10, but not for the reasons they gave it a 10. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I don't know if I'd give it a 10, because I don't think I could think of an album really. I mean, maybe In Rainbows, but even that I don't think I'd give a 10. So I think giving it a 10 is ridiculous.
What's the point of having a 10 if you're not going to give it to anyone?
Well, how can you give a 10 to anything? Like what album is so perfect that it gets a 10? My favourite album of all time, In Rainbows or The Nationals Boxer, neither of them are perfect. They've both got things that I would maybe change slightly. This is not a perfect album, but it's a fucking fascinating album, and it's a really, really good album. But there's no way it's like there's songs that I don't love, and there's bits that are sort of left in where maybe they shouldn't be and stuff like that. But that's what makes it really interesting for her, I think, because in the past she has seemed very polished. So yeah, perfect 10's a load of bollocks.
Fair enough. So we don't do scores on this podcast, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, we don't do scores on the website reviews either, do we? Because scores are ridiculous. Like, what's 8.3 for an album and what's 8.4? What's the difference between those two?
Yeah, well, I can see that.
Yeah.
Anyway, Matt, before we argue about scores, tell us what you thought of the album, man.
I really love this album. I think it's going to be pretty much the same kind of comments as you guys. I guess I'd only listened to Tidal before this, which we covered on the podcast. That didn't spur me to listen to anything else because I really didn't like it, and so I was pretty skeptical. And then even with the first track, it sounded like more of the same. But then the outro got really weird, and then I became interested. And then Shamika was just like, there's so much like frenetic piano playing. It's kind of jarring and it's weird, and it just barrels forward in this kind of madcap way. It really kind of dragged me in. And then as you mentioned, those next run of tracks are just like amazing. I think the thing that actually Nick mentioned about the percussive stuff is what actually I really liked about the album. I think the way that she used percussion actually, like we talked about lyrics last time and how I'm like on the fence about how
What the fuck's
much
about
how,
lyrics?
Yeah, how can
how
you like this album
important
if you
they
don't
are.
really care about lyrics? That's unbelievable to me.
But the thing is, I do like lyrics. It's just they're not the first thing that grabs me. But like you were saying, lyrics were so accessible, and so well done that I couldn't help but be drawn into them. And then I think that's accompanied by the percussion, in which I felt like she was using the percussion to mirror what she was saying in a really interesting way. Like in Fetch the Bolt Cutters, feels oppressive, and it feels like she is trying to break free with all like her layering of voices. It's all just very disorienting, and I think that is the whole point. I think it's purposeful. And then you can have something like Relay, and you have this almost clicking noise for the percussion. And it feels
I'm with you on that, Matt. I totally agree. I think it's that's what makes it really interesting in some ways, is the percussion is so haphazard and deliberate, I think. So yeah, I'm with Matt on that one.
I just felt like it was. I just felt, as I said, like it was actually distracting at certain points, which from what the core message is, which is unfortunate. But I didn't hate it, but that part of it, I mean, but it was a bit irritating sometimes.
Yeah, I think it just adds. It's for me, it adds an extra layer to the message, which all in all, I thought it was super impressive, and I think it completely changed my opinion of her, and makes me actually want to listen to some of her other work, which, for better or worse, I don't know if this is a unique album in her.
I believe that it is, from what I've read and what I've heard. I think this is kind of quite different to what she's done before. In terms of its openness, its lyricism. I think everything. I think in general she's usually a lot more polished than this. So yeah, I'm going to dig back a little bit. I've listened to two of her albums, which is Tidal and the one with the ridiculously long title about an idler wheel. It goes on for about 400 words. Not really a big fan. I liked both of them. I thought they were both okay, but neither of them inspired me to sort of spend any time going back to them and going back to other albums. Whereas this one was, superb.
Well, maybe I'll just stick with this one and save it.
So a 9.7 then, Matt. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, I don't know.
I'm going to score it out of 5, and I'll give it a 4.2.
I think you can't do a score until it's been a couple years.
I'm going to go with 3.5 squared.
3.5 squared.
Yeah.
That's pretty much 10.
4 biscuits, I'll give it.
All right. What's
Cool.
next?
And so that was actually going to be my answer to what the Fran's question is, which is, which album is most likely to stick with you until you're an old man?
So the album that is most likely to stick with me until I'm an old man is Fiona Apple with Fetch the Bolt Cutters. And it is, and I'm afraid I can't give you another answer for that question, because there's no way any of the other albums will stick with me until I'm an old man. Do you want to give me another question, or do you want me to just talk about my next favourite album?
Yeah, pick your next favourite.
What about, can you answer Nick's question?
What was Nick's question? Which was my teen self?
Yeah.
Your teenage self.
Fiona Apple, Fetch the Bolt Cutters?
Oh my god.
So
difficult.
probably. Do you know what? Probably, actually, I will go with EOB's for that question. Yeah, I will. That makes sense to me. But yeah, because I think some of it is... I loved Radiohead when I was a teenager, and Ed's kind of the Mr. Reliable of Radiohead. He's the sort of guy who's always been into the guitar music side of things, and I think you can see that in this album. Probably the influences that he puts into this album is similar to stuff I would have listened to as a teenager. So yeah, probably this one. But honestly, first of all, I found it quite a bizarre record, and I'm still not totally certain what I think of it after more than a month of listening. I think, as I just said, he's the Mr. Reliable of Radiohead. He does the guitar and the backing vocals, and he's always had the same role with the band all the way through. And I think that shows in this first solo album, because I think it mixes some of Radiohead's ideas. It's kind of experimental. It mixes a few different genres, but then in other ways it's kind of more traditional rock sounding. And that is why I find it a bit strange in the end. It feels like someone who wanted to do their own thing away from the band, but wasn't exactly sure what that thing was. Kind of found the album a little bit like a mood board of ideas for what his sound should be, rather than being a totally coherent album. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. I don't think it is. I think there are some good songs here. I think the album opens well. I like Shangri-La. I think it's a really fun, light-hearted, uplifting song. And I think it really opens by setting Ed apart from Radiohead. I think Brazil, the following song, is good. Probably the most interesting song in terms of development. Like, it really switches up halfway through. I think those and the Laura Marlin duet at the end are probably my favourite songs. But then songs like Deep Days and Banksters, I thought, kind of ruined the flow of the album. So yeah, I don't think it's something I regularly return to. But as a teenager, I probably would have been more into this than any of the other albums on this list, I think. And I do admire Ed for, at this stage of his career, like Radiohead had 9 albums in, and he doesn't need to do his own thing, but he's put something out that is pretty interesting and doesn't really sound very much like Radiohead at all. So I think, yeah, it's an interesting album, but I can't imagine going back to it loads.
Cool. I'm gonna dive in there and say I agree with some of what Fran said, but there are several songs on here which just feel like Radiohead songs. I think you said that Shangri-La
sets nothing like Radiohead, any of it, mate.
Shangri-La sets him apart, but it just sounds like Radiohead.
Sounds nothing like Radiohead. Anyway, carry on, but...
Yeah, it does. It
sounds... Fran, shout him down. Come on, don't let him speak.
It doesn't. It's nonsense.
It's almost like... It's not as good as Radiohead. It feels like a part of Radiohead, but it feels like, I don't know, maybe he made a demo that's going to be contributed to the next album, and then everyone else is going to take it apart and build it back together. And this was maybe a seed point for that, which to me makes sense. But I think I totally get what you say about it. Does feel like he has an idea for several projects, and he just doesn't know what his identity is. He has this like folky side project. He's like that synthy electronic side project, and then more Radiohead stuff. I would really want him to do the more synthy stuff. Like Brazil is really, really cool. I think you mentioned that one as your highlight, and I think it's definitely the strongest song on there. But all in all, I like, it was weirdly incoherent, but at the same time, it just felt, even the folky stuff, because he sings so like softly, it all felt like a weirdly ambient, atmospheric album. But because of that, it just felt very, although it was kind of relaxing to listen to, it felt very passive as a whole thing. So I think I have similar medium feelings about this.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like Radiohead though, but I agree with most of what you said apart from that.
The only question though is, does it sound like Radiohead? That's the question I was going to ask you.
Yeah. No, it doesn't sound like Radiohead.
Let's see what Nick thinks.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. So, I'm glad we picked this one right after the Fiona Apple, because this is the other one I was going to refer to as being like a mirror, because I feel like it's musically decent, musically solid, but very, very weak lyrically, and really kind of missing out on a lot of that. And it has this, I mean, you described it as something like relaxing or something, man. I think that's probably quite a bad criticism, but in general, I think that sort of fits. That it is very clean and straight laced and kind of reliable, as Fran said. But lyrically, it's got some shockingly juvenile stuff in it. Like, not juvenile, that's a bit harsh. Shockingly simple stuff in it. So, for example, Olympic. Here's a lyric from Olympic. Somebody will, somebody won't, somebody do, and somebody don't. I have cried 1,000 times just to see what's on your mind. I could go on, but it's just not
poetry.
It's not poetry. Well, maybe it's poetry. It's just terrible poetry. So, so I was really disappointed with that side of it, and I just felt like it gave the impression that he didn't have a lot to say, really. And I think that's I can see both sides of the argument about whether it's like Radiohead. It's not like Radiohead in anything that's good about Radiohead. It's very much like a watered down version of what Radiohead gets to sometimes when they put in a lot of work to sort of work it up. So I like Matt's analogy that it might be a demo that then they would sort of begin work on, So another one would be a Deep Days, which is shockingly shallow. Oh, you see what I did there? Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Where you sleep, I will sleep. And when you rise, can anyone guess? I will rise. Yeah, well done. So that again, it just seems really tired and just not that exciting. And certainly Tom just leaves him in the dust on anything along those lines with lyrics. So that was a pity. There were some songs I like more.
I mean,
than
it's
others.
big to compare him to Tom, though. It's like,
Yeah, I realise.
just because he's in the same band as Tom, I think it's hard for Tom York's lyrics to leave everyone in the dust, don't they? Really,
it's a logical connection though that he's in the same band and he is trying to strike out on his own. I mean, you can't expect that he's not going to be compared to Radiohead in this work. I mean, there's just no way. So
he's got to experience that firsthand as well. So he gets to learn from the master, as it were. And he's not taken any of those lessons.
I think that's harsh, man.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem like he was. You could tell that he was the bit that's like Radiohead is the bit where it feels like you could tell he was the kind of bass underlying structural sort of guitar work for some Radiohead songs without any of the bells and whistles and without the subtlety, So again, I feel like I'm coming across worse about it than I intended to. I will say there are some songs I liked, like Mass, for example. I quite like that one. Has a really nice overdriven kind of acoustics and vox, airy vox and acoustic. And acoustic guitar. None
of us know what you're talking about
totally
anyway, so there's no point correcting yourself. We don't know what you mean anyway.
Yeah, there's some nice noises. I'll just put it that way, shall I?
Yeah, some good noises on it.
Yeah. So so Mass is the high point in the album, in my opinion. But otherwise, I just kept feeling like it was just very tired, and that wasn't exciting. So I'm disappointed.
Well, that's a good counterbalance to Fiona Apple.
Exactly. And you see what I mean about it being like that, and it does the difference.
Yeah,
the mirroring.
Yeah, it is.
It's the absolute
exactly
antithesis of what Fiona Apple's saying. So
yeah.
I'm just disagreeing for the point of it now, really. To be honest.
What a surprise.
So I'm gonna talk now about the one my teenage self would definitely be into, which is without a doubt the Strokes, because I was obsessed with the Strokes, and so anything made by them, I would have been into. And so. Since obviously they started, I kind of fell off the bandwagon a couple albums ago. But like putting this on for the first time and hearing that first riff, it just, I don't know, it sounded like the Strokes instantly. Even if I didn't know that this was the artist, there's something about the way that Albert Hammond Jr. has his guitar tone or the way he plays. It just sounds like them. Fisher? Did you say Fisher Price?
Yeah, it's like a Fisher Price guitar. Anyway, carry on.
That's supposed to be the comment of the review of the whole podcast. Yeah. That's brilliant.
Sorry, carry on.
Which, I don't know, I think it's interesting considering they sparked all these different copycat bands, and the next decade was full of these indie bands emulating them, and still they sound so specifically them. And still, also Julian Casablancas, his voice still sounds pretty amazing. I think he still sounds super cool, but that's probably my inbuilt biases on that. But all in all, I thought this album was actually just a bit of a slog. It was.
Oh well, I wasn't expecting that to come out of you. This is great, but it's a slog.
The first song, it just was it was so reminiscent, and it brought back so many memories of listening to their first album, and then I just realized it felt like I was listening to them on 0.8x speed. They just were slow. They bite. They just seemed like they were going through the motions essentially, and I just their whole point was this kind of urgency. And this guitar interplay, and the fact that it almost felt like they were just couldn't get the music out of themselves quick enough, and this didn't feel like that at all. I think they did try and do something a little bit different with their more synthy 80s pop vibe, but I don't know. I don't know if any of you have listened to The Voids, which is Julian Casablancas' side project.
I don't know it at all. No, I know the name, but that's it.
They in that they really double down on the synthwave vibe and really go for it. And so it doesn't feel I don't know. It doesn't feel as meek. It feels like they've really bought in, and so this just made me want to actually just listen to that as opposed to this.
Fair enough.
So for me, it was just kind of disappointing, and just maybe want to just go listen to other albums as opposed to this album.
It's always a good outcome, isn't it?
Album.
That's exactly what they want.
Who's going?
Who wants to go?
I'll go.
You go, yeah.
So I was aware and into for a few weeks the first album. What's it called? This is it. Yeah. And I remember thinking that was going to be quite an important sort of record in terms of the movement of loads of bands that came out following it. After that, I really lost interest because I felt like they were really didn't change the record. Really just kind of kept it going with the same kind of stuff. And I'm consistency-wise, I'm happy to report that this album is exactly like I expected it to be. It's completely formulaic, almost all the way through. It's just the first song, as Matt pointed out, sounds just like it came off that first album. Maybe slightly slower, but generally very, very consistent with that first album, which I think was got to be 20 years ago, or nearly 20 years ago, isn't it?
Yeah, 2001.
Ago. There you go. Yeah, so nearly 20 years ago, and they're releasing music that sounds like it could be off that album, almost identical. And there's just so dull to go through this same process. Of the kind of, it's all very square and regular. It's all the little tinny guitar that he plays, which I like Fran's reference to what that sounded like. But it is a very sort of thin sound, and I don't mind it to start with. It just gets really old. It just gets so old. And if you listen to the album through from start to finish, I think you get 5 tracks in Eternal Summer before you hear anything that's different from the others. I mean, to me,
and then it's really, really bad.
I'm not saying I love that song, but at least that song has some change to it from the others, which sounds so generically Strokes, So I just really feel like they're overstaying. Their quality is massively overstayed. Their reputation is massively overstayed. Obviously, their most famous disciple is the Arctic Monkeys, and I know he's actually referenced them specifically in his last atrocious album. But I can see the connection in terms of the sort of playful nature of the way they talk and stuff, and some of the stories they tell. But Arctic Monkeys leave this band behind and have done from day one. And lyrically, musically they do so. Lyrically, it's just almost hilarious to think that the Arctics think of themselves as somehow following the footsteps of the Strokes. That's just not a fair comparison. So they also get the most lumbering solo award for Not the Same Anymore, which is, just so tedious. It's a lo-fi solo, which I'm fine with, but it's just so melodically dull. It just seems to fall asleep while he's playing it. So yeah, I pretty much hated this album and did it, and I expected to hate it, and ultimately, for better or worse, I was proven correct. Yeah.
Why did you pick it?
Yeah, why did you pick it?
Because there was a lot of people talking about it, and I still hold to the idea that I picked these albums blind. I just picked it because I knew it was coming out, and it was.
It's not blind because it's the Strokes, so you knew what it was going to sound like.
Well, I was hoping they'd reinvented themselves, but no, they did. They certainly did not. Yeah.
Okay, so me.
Fran's gonna love it now. Fran's gonna be like.
I was really hoping
completely.
that there was going to be some counterpoints to my argument because look, I hate the Strokes.
You've always hated them, haven't you?
I've always hated them, and I've made that clear regularly during our Twitter tournaments, and every time anyone mentions the Strokes, I make it clear that I do not understand this band. But putting that aside, I wanted to go into this with an open mind. I wanted to try and view this as its own product rather than just another bloody Strokes record. It was called The New Abnormal, so maybe they were going to do something new that would blow me away. And then I listened to the opening song, the Fisher-Price one, The Adults Are Talking, and it just has every single element that make this band the most drab, generic thing since White Toast, all rolled up in one song. Straight away. So fucking bland, so uninteresting, so unoriginal. And then you go to Selfless, the second song, and Casablancas just drones another dull, predictable melody, predictable keyboard line, and the same exact percussion progression as the previous song. And if there's a more weaker, bog-standard start to a song than the beginning of Brooklyn Bridge to Chorus, then I'm yet to hear it. This song sounds like it was made for the American Pie Reunion soundtrack. It's fucking awful. And I haven't got time to lay into every song in the way I would like to here, so I'm just going to stop at the next one. But the next song is Bad Decisions. This might be the most annoying song I've heard yet in 2020. How a band that made a chorus this drab can be considered anything more than a dire cover band of bad 80s music, I don't know. It's making bad decisions, making bad decisions, making bad decisions, making bad decisions. They just need to fuck off, really. And ironically, I heard that this song, Bad Decisions, was so generic and copycat that they had to give a writing credit to Billy Idol because it sounds so much like previous stuff that they had to fucking credit Billy Idol for it. So amazing. That just sums it up, right? There isn't a single moment on this album when I felt anything other than bored. They've always been a bad band, but this is embarrassing. How they've made a career out of one sound that isn't even an interesting sound, I don't know. This album just is terrible. That's me for the Strokes.
In a past life, I actually met the bass player when he did his solo project, talking about EOB. We did his solo project, and it was, I'll be honest, quite a bit worse than the Strokes.
What?
Yeah.
Really?
And well, I would never listen to
any of their
I met him before he went on stage, and I was like, because I was reviewing it for another site I used to work for, and I was like, oh, this is, good luck, hope it goes well, and all this. And afterwards, I was like trying to hide out in the back so he wouldn't see I was still there because it was so bad. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing more to say about it. I mean, I'm surprised though. I was hoping that one of you would love it just to give it a bit of balance.
It's bad.
That got worse and worse. That was quite interesting.
It's a poor. Even like, I get the first, like, their style, and the first album isn't necessarily for everyone because it really hit a kind of niche. But this was just even a pale impression of themselves. So, like, what's the point?
Yeah.
I don't get the first album, but anyway, we're not here to talk about the first album.
We know that.
Yeah, we heard that one. We heard that one.
I don't get it.
Message received.
Yeah. Did I tell you I hate the Strokes?
Yeah.
The amazing thing is, this is not by some distance the worst album on this list. But anyway, we'll talk
it
about
was.
It in a minute.
Yeah,
no.
it was.
Oh no. Yeah. Anyway, what's next? What's next, Matt?
Well, do you want to talk about? Well, I don't necessarily want to talk about the worst album.
Okay, go something positive then.
I'm gonna talk about Sawayama.
Okay.
Because I don't think this is the worst album. I actually really enjoyed this album, and I found it a very kind of sharp shock after listening to the Strokes, because it was very purposeful. I think it was really full of ideas. I thought it was really interesting. I couldn't believe this was someone's debut album, because it seemed like they knew exactly kind of what they wanted, whether you like it or not, and they managed to, I think, successfully blend these different genres that I never thought would actually fit together. It just felt like all of the late 90s music just jammed into one.
I'm not saying what I feel about this album, but to say that it felt like an album where they knew what they wanted, I think is mental.
Well, no, I think this is someone who has diverse tastes and diverse interests, and they wanted to make an album where it fit together, and it did to at least a pretty good extent. Like fitting like those giant like new metal guitars, fitting it next to like some R&B and power pop, and actually making it sound like a coherent song. Like in like STFU, and then she's got like her singing is like almost Pearl Jammy in that song, but then she switches to like kind of more poppier style of singing later on. It like totally works, and then like you have it in the same album as like Paradising or Paradising,
yeah,
which was almost like a super radio friendly J-pop song, which then also had a sax solo in it. I just couldn't believe what I was listening to, and I like it was over dramatic, it was very hammy, but it was all very deliberate, and I thought it was really fun, if not really intense and kind of exhausting to listen to, but I think generally in a good way.
Okay. Shall I jump in?
Yeah, go for it.
So yeah, I mean, I wasn't arguing like on the quality. I think for me, it's to say that it seems to know what it wants is I'm not sure that it does. But maybe you're right. Maybe she wanted it to be totally chaotic. But I mean, I think it sets out the store pretty early. I think the opener Dynasty is pretty much as dramatic and overblown as you can get. But I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing. I think the second song, Excess, I think there's actually something really interesting about that ties into a lot of what we've spoken about recently on the podcast with, you know, how we look at pop and whether we can get past certain elements that are too poppy, because this track is pure pop. Like it sounds a bit Britney, a bit Christina. But I actually find myself quite enjoying that song. And there's no way I would have said that if you look back in the past that I would have talked about Britney and Christina and said I enjoyed it. But I quite enjoy that song. So maybe I've got past some of that pop problem. And I think, yeah, the next song is Shut the Fuck Up. You know, that's another quite good song, but it sums up everything that makes this album, for me, difficult to love as a whole. Because it is totally chaotic. You can't really decide if it's pop, if it's rock, if it's emo, if it's goth. It just switches up a little bit too much for me. So that's kind of my feelings about the album as a whole. It's just a little bit too changeable.
Why does it have to go in a box?
It doesn't have to go in a box necessarily, but I think...
Yeah, Fran, break down the barriers, Fran. Come on.
Well, it's just like if I'm sat listening to an album and I'm trying to enjoy an album, and then 1 second it's a very sort of light poppy song, and the next second she's screaming at me, and then it's a song like Chosen Family, which is so like saccharine. It's hard to sort of get into totally. So there's some things I enjoy here, but you know, when we switch from a Britney style song to an Evanescence style song to a song that sounds like not quite as good a version of Christine and the Queens, I'm never gonna fully get into it. But like, I liked Excess, I liked Fuck This World, but I couldn't really recommend the album as a whole. I think she's an interesting artist though, and I can see why she's creating some buzz, and I will look at stuff she does in the future. But as a whole, this album was just a bit too messy for me.
So I'll go in now. I had a unique problem I've never had before, which is my wife, refused.
How long have you been married?
Who's your girlfriend? What's your girlfriend's name?
Nearly, exactly. Yeah. Same as my wife, let's just be clear.
Your wife, but I've not met this girlfriend.
She hated this album so much that she would refuse to have me play it around when she was around, which made it really difficult. And she was really like, "What?"
I've had that loads on this podcast. There's so many albums Kirsten's told me to turn off.
This is the first time she was that viscerally in contempt of it. Yeah. So, okay. So basically, obviously, anyone who knows me from this podcast knows that it's not going to be a genre that I'm going to have an easy time with. I found it very, very clean production throughout, like to polish and shiny to the point where it was a little bit hard to connect with, really, even though I could see there was some themes and some depth in what she was talking about in STFU, etc. I am also, like with pop, not at all a fan of nu metal, and it was sounded like that song in particular was with that kind of faux macho-ness of nu metal has always been the thing I've really hated, and I had a difficult time with that track as well. So again, I think it has some things it's trying to get to. I can't imagine, I'll just be honest and say I can't imagine I'd ever go back to it because it's just not a genre I can get into, really. But I will say there was Paradising or Paradising or whatever, this failed spelling of which is fucking irritating. Was shockingly facile. I felt like it was really just too much down that road, even for what is clearly a pop album in many ways. It contained my two worst musical tropes in a song, which is a squeaky saxophone solo, which was really, really grating, and then secondly a lazy key change, like near the end, where you just like da-da-da, da-da-da, you do the same thing again, just step up one. Oh, it's just like, come on. So I didn't like that at all, really. But there were bits and bobs that I thought were okay. But I can't see me going back to it. And I thought the mix of genres and stuff was sometimes clever, but they weren't genres that I was in love with in the first place. So that made it more difficult for me. So yeah,
it's like 7 genres that you don't like in one album, basically.
Exactly. That's what it's saying. Yeah. So there you go. That was a problem for me. Anyways, that's me.
Yeah, cool. So Fran, do you want to take us home with Yoko Ono?
So right, now we've all been putting it off, basically, haven't we? Let's be honest.
Well, I'm going to run you through my 9 stages of Yoko Ono, getting to know the Yoko Ono album. So stage one, I always assumed Yoko Ono would do pretty shitty folk music, so I got that wrong. Stage two was, what the fuck is this record? Stage three was,
bloody hell, 9 stages or something.
Yeah. Stage three was, oh god, I left the room while I was listening to AOS and the volume was on full, so the neighbours are going to think I'm watching some really fucked up porn. Stage four was, what the fuck is this record? Stage five was, you know what though, I'm actually kind of getting into this album. It reminds me a little bit of the Sugar Cubes record we did, only with more screeching and less actual words. So it's actually better than I expected. Stage six was, you know what, I think I actually prefer it to anything by the Beatles. So all the stuff we've heard about Yoko Ono over the year, you know, she's better than anything they did. Stage seven was, I think I quite like Yoko Ono. And then stage eight was, but I probably won't listen to it again, and I kind of wish she said some words instead of just yelping. And then the final stage was, what the fuck is this record? So I don't really know.
That was really good. I like it.
Yes, I don't really know what I thought of this record, but yeah, that's me.
Okay, who's going?
Cool.
Matt,
Sure. I'll go. Some aspects of this I did actually like, but there were other at times I was just like, I just felt bad for suggesting this to everyone. Like, the first two songs are just, I think that's the real sticking point, is her vocals in them are just, I know I knew she was supposed to be avant-garde. I didn't expect a folk album, but that was just a bit too much. I actually kind of liked the music behind it, and it did feel like a funky jam session, which makes me feel really old for saying.
Yeah, you go with the oldest of the group from that comment.
Yeah. But then, yeah, I like. Why some of the songs I just didn't feel like anything happened. Like, why not until the final minute nothing happened? The last 3 tracks, I feel like nothing happened in them. They were just really quiet. But I enjoyed Greenfield Morning in the middle. So
you learned some names of songs.
Yeah, I wrote them down for once.
Wow.
And I just for me, after listening to Fiona Apple's album and Sawayama's album, which were both full of interesting experimentation and pushing the boundaries, I was left thinking, is this what pushing the boundaries looked like then? Or is this just her trying to get attention with John and trying to like capitalize on the position she was in and do a fuck you to everyone else? I don't know. But yeah, it's not better than the Beatles.
I mean, I would rather listen to this than anything by the Beatles, really.
Yeah.
I mean, at least it's doing something. You know, I mean, I've just taken the piss a little bit, but I actually didn't mind this. You know, it was all right. It's the yelping's weird, but musically, it's quite an interesting album. I don't think it's terrible. I really don't. I think it's I think there's some good stuff there.
Do you know who did the music?
No.
John and Ringo.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting. I mean,
so you like the Beatles?
No, because you know what? I'd rather have yelping and stuff that sounds like really, really pornographic screeching than I would have love me do, you know I love you, or please me. I mean, it's, you know, the Beatles were never interesting, sorry, but at least this is kind of interesting.
It must be Paul who doesn't like in the Beatles. That's obviously the answer, Matt.
Yeah, no, Paul is the one that I struggle with the most. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, in a really weird digression, I actually managed to sleep through this album once, which I thought was amazing. So I put the playlist on, and I will concede I was really, really tired because I had insomnia and stuff, but all the same, I woke up and it was just on the last bars of the last song, and I was like, fucking hell, that is some kind of power I've got over this music. But
what were the dreams like?
They were pretty skittish and nightmarish, yeah. So, So, and the terrible news is that I cannot for the life of me find anywhere the YouTube video of her performance at 2014's Glastonbury Festival, which I have seen more than once, and I don't know who's pulled it down. They obviously sort of stepped on it and pulled it down. But if anyone can find it, it's the greatest musical performance ever. It's actually been listed as the worst live musical performance ever on about 3 or 4 different sites. That I was in the process of trying to find the performance on YouTube. I found this listing, worst performance ever, and it kept coming up at the top of the list. So
Nice.
the band, no, not the band. Yoko is a terribly unfunny joke. And it's just a total nightmare from start to finish. And the really sad thing about it is there's actually a band there of musicians. You know, we're talking about whether or not you like the Beatles or not, but those people who played that music can actually play music and are trying to do something of some value. And she is just walking in and just doing a massive fuck you to all of them and all of us as well for forcing us to listen to it, you know? So it's not worth any more attention than that, and I feel like it's a pity that I've given it this much, honestly. It seems like attention grabbing is all she has to offer. I was thinking to myself, she's like a 1970s Kardashian, basically. She just has nothing of any substance, of any value or meaning, except what she can grab in the attention of others. So I just thought it was absolutely atrocious. And
Still better than the Strokes, though.
No. This is really off the fucking charts. So yeah, not my favourite.
Cool.
It's better than the Strokes.
I would probably agree with Fran just because I was so disappointed with the Strokes.
Wow, you people.
In fact, if I was going to, when I was trying to think what would last for me, because we'll probably move on to talk about the playlist shortly, but which would last to me as an old man after Fiona Apple, I might have even said Yoko Ono was the next one. It might be the next most interesting album after the Fiona Apple on this list to me, personally.
Really?
Yeah. But that's not saying a lot. Like, I didn't like... I mean, I liked it. I liked Earth. I liked EOB, but I didn't like the other albums.
I compare it to, like... Because this came out in the 70s, right? And we've listened to Can, and we listened to I've forgotten the full name, but the one with carpet in it.
I don't know which one that is.
Carpet?
Carpet rollers or something? I don't know. Flying carpet.
I think I know who you mean, but I think they didn't have the 13th floor elevators.
The elevators, yeah.
Not carpets.
For some reason I thought it was a
What's it got to do with it?
13th floor elevator carpets. You just added a word to the end of it.
I think they were a lot more interesting and experimenting and doing this cool, like, just really, really trying to push things in interesting ways.
Yeah.
And compared to, like, and if that's what the experimentation looked like at that time, this doesn't hold up to that.
How about, Matt, because we talked about in the last episode, we talked a bit about the classic, which was Neil Young, which you said was the worst classic we'd done.
Yeah.
Neil Young or Yoko
Ono?
You can't be debating this at length. Fucking hell.
I might pick Yoko Ono just
I'd pick Yoko Ono
Morning.
as well. Yeah, I'd go with Yoko Ono.
Just fuck off. It's just, and she doesn't deserve this amount of attention. This is exactly my problem. I don't want to have anyone speak about her again. She cannot be spoken of. I mean, she's just to be ignored now.
Totally disagree. Totally disagree.
Yeah. After this, I listened to a couple of her folkier tracks and her duets with John, and some of them are actually quite nice. They were quite soothing.
Well, I've got to go now and get some other people to do a podcast with because you two are wankers.
Cool. So, beyond the classic, what did you guys think of the playlist?
I thought it was pretty weak. I love the Fiona Apple, and there's nothing else I was that excited about at all. And there's one obviously that I despised. So, I wasn't really very pleased, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with Nick. I'm not agreeing with the one that I despised. It's a different one, but same for me. It wasn't after a really good playlist last time, and actually, what looks like it's going to be a really good playlist next time. This was a bit of a shit sandwich, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Fiona Apple was fantastic, though. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, I think this was medium to strong, just because Fiona Apple was so good, and I like the Sawayama album a lot, and like EOB wasn't particularly memorable, but it was actually quite nice to listen to, and
relaxing,
like, considering everything else going
there.
No, the EOB was decent. The EOB was decent.
It was nice, atmospheric passive. It meant I could actually turn off for a little bit.
It's pleasant, you want to.
But whenever I had to listen to the Strokes album, that was like just torturous for me.
Yeah, it felt like pointless, that one. But hey, well, we'll see what happens next month.
Yes.
But before we get to that, I'm going to talk a little bit about Jay-Z and the Blueprint. So I've actually written about Jay-Z before for the PGP's website. I think the article was something about rap isn't real music or something.
Yes.
So I don't want to completely rehash that. But that was really focused on Collision Course. And
you weren't arguing the rap isn't real music, I hope. That's not the conclusion you're wishing our listeners to draw.
So as a teen, I just pretty much listened to indie, and that was it. And I didn't like pop music. I didn't like hip hop. I didn't like anything electronic. If there was no guitars, I wasn't really interested in it. And I decided it wasn't good music because, in my very educated 14-year-old opinion, that was the supreme. Listening to the Strokes and nothing else, right? And so then I was really into nu metal as well, and he collaborated with Linkin Park, who were one of my favorite bands at the time, to make Collision Course, and that actually made me pay attention to his music really for the first time. Anyone really doing any kind of hip hop type of rap, as opposed to just rapping over some overblown guitars. And actually watching some of the videos that came out alongside Collision Course, where you could actually see him working. You could see him modifying his flow to fit with these songs, which were faster and had different points where he had to emphasize, and seeing his dexterity to be able to do that made me kind of realize this guy's actually got something going on. And then once I'd opened that door, every other door fell. I think for me, once my mind was open to something else, I started listening to other hip hop, and then I started listening to electronic music and everything else beyond that. So this was obviously, he's a hugely important artist for me for actually becoming a music fan, as opposed to just someone who's just into guitars and listening to guitars. And I think one of the things that draws me specifically to Jay-Z over some of the other rappers of the time is, I think, the way he kind of positions himself. He's always was pushing himself and putting so much PR for himself in just as he was kind of ascending, stylizing himself as the best rapper of all time. And as I was just turning onto hip hop, I believed him. And so now I probably wouldn't consider him to be the best, right? But I do appreciate the fact that he has his own unique style. He's often a little bit more old school, and he often has this kind of jazzier feel where he's more laid back and relaxed with his flow as well. He seems to kind of effortlessly rap over the top of stuff without putting too much effort in, where I see some other artists have a completely different style where it's more they can't they need to get it out of them almost, and it's much more I don't know a word for it, but much more in your face, as opposed to just kicking back. And so specifically why I chose this album, because I thought this isn't my favorite album by him, which I think is what I'm supposed to do.
That's interesting. But, interesting choice. Yeah.
I think this is a really interesting album because it came out in 2001 at the same time as the Strokes, within the same week. They both came out at the same week as September 11th.
Oh wow.
So they came out a really interesting time in world history, and I think it's also the first time he worked with Kanye West, and so all the soul samples that you hear, kind of that are the centerpieces of the songs themselves, were picked by Kanye and then cleaned up by him to essentially make the songs what they are. And it was obviously hugely successful. So I think this album is what really catapulted Jay and Kanye onto a new level.
It's largely considered his best, right, as well by the majority of.
And so and that's the other thing. Like, I don't think this album helped shape the next 10 to 15 years of music, and often is rated as maybe one of the best albums in the 2000s. And I still don't think it's his best. A lot of people think his debut's his best, or this one. I actually think the Black Album is my favourite, which came out a couple of years after that. Because I don't know, it has more hits. This album generally it feels kind of clean. It feels very simple, and I think, reflecting on it now, after I had some I used this month as an excuse to really dive into it, I really enjoyed it, but I don't think it is actually that standout. So I'm not going to try and convince you of that. But I do think it demonstrates still demonstrates his skills as a rapper, and there are some absolute we can talk about Takeover. It's still ridiculous. It's an absolute one of the best diss tracks I've heard. He just takes Nas apart, which in some sense is Nas was very much on the descent after Illmatic and hadn't made that much other really good stuff.
He makes that point, doesn't he, repeatedly?
Yeah, and just some of the lines he uses, he talks about sampling his voice, and then telling him he was using it wrong, and he made it a hot line, and Jay turned it into a hot song, and it's just so brutal. And then the way he finishes with the fact that Nas was actually his only rival and no one else is even worth making a song about. I love it. I love his bravado and his confidence that he really carries over into everything else. And the other interesting point, I think, after talking about the Strokes, is seeing how much Jay-Z's evolved and keeps pushing forward. While the Strokes are making the same music 20 years later. So yeah, that is what I think about this album and Jay.
So it's not really what I love anymore. It's what I like quite a bit then. Really, the wrong category there.
Well, I love him.
Interesting exercise though, because I did that with the horror songs. I did put in some stuff I thought wasn't as strong as other bits. So yeah,
I think that's good. It's to demonstrate someone's career.
Yeah,
I might jump in if that's okay, Matt, because I think some of what you were talking about ties in quite well to. Were you going to say something there though?
I was just like I was saying, this isn't my favorite album. I really use this as an excuse to really check myself and see if I really didn't think this was one of the best albums of the decade, and I don't.
Interesting. Well, I will say I am really, really glad we did this album, and I'm glad I've had some time to spend with Jay-Z. I don't, being a big hip hop fan, I'm not really sure how he's passed me by to the extent that he has, because obviously he's huge. But I've been meaning to do something about that for a long time, and I'm glad you went with this album, because I've heard so much about it, and I've heard it several times and in several different publications, called the best hip-hop album of all time. And it is a good hip-hop album. It's a really good hip-hop album. I was really, really into it. Really glad that I spent time listening to it. There's so many great tunes. Izzo, Girls, Jigger, Heart of the City, Renegade. It's totally clear to me why this guy is so huge. And I did really, really enjoy this album. But it's interesting that you talked about Takeover, because for me, I don't know if it's just because I haven't spent as much time with Jay-Z as I have with other artists that he talks about on this album, but I did find myself getting a bit frustrated with his bragging. I thought it was pretty brave to go after Nas and Mobb Deep in a song, because they're two of the best of all time. And there's a line on one of the songs where he says, "If I'm not as good as Big, I'm the closest one." And I really enjoyed this album, but I do struggle putting him on that level. Because I think it's something about that flow you talked about, which Biggie had that flow, that sort of laid back flow as well, and it works sometimes. But for me, sometimes that flow isn't quite as impressive. I think I do need to listen to more albums before I can say where Jay sits, but I did find some of that a little bit off-putting, and I'll be honest, he doesn't even have the best verses on this album. Eminem rips him to shreds on Renegade. Eminem's verses on Renegade are incredible. And I think that's really interesting because Nas came back with a song. I don't know if you know about that, but Nas came back with a song after this where he talks about how Eminem ripped him to shreds on Renegade. And I've always not really paid that much attention to that because I don't know Jay that well. But listening to it, Eminem's incredible on that song. And that's, for me, the best song on the album. But he is amazing. And I'm really glad I spent this time with this album, and I will spend more time getting to know him. I'm glad you said actually that there's another album that you prefer, because I'll go to the Black Album next. I think I was kind of wondering where to go next, but I think he needs a little bit of a talking to about putting himself as the next best after Big, because I'm not having that yet.
I think it was also the timing, right? This was when he was really ascending very fast, and people were telling him he's just like Biggie.
And it's a big part of hip hop, isn't it? It's a big part of hip hop.
From literally the same neighborhood, and so he was always going to be compared specifically to him. And it was as some of the these other larger rappers were losing, or their reputation was waning. Yeah. And so I think by positioning himself as that, some of it was about convincing everyone else of that.
Yeah. I think he was a bit of a refresher, wasn't he, for hip hop in some ways as well? Like you say, it's a time when some people are on the wane, which is interesting. But it's I think that's a big part of hip hop. Every rapper does it, But sometimes I think choose your targets. Like, don't go after Mobb Deep. But yeah, it's still, like I say, I loved it. I think it's on the poppier side of hip hop for me in some respects. Tracks like Izzo and Girls, they're poppy to a degree, but I don't mind that. I really liked it a lot. But Eminem has the best verse on it, so there we go.
Okay, I'll jump in then. So overall, I'm glad you put this on the list as well. Like Fran said, I think other than the Fiona Apple, it's the only other one that I came back to with some sense of enjoyment or looking forward to it. It is unbelievably expensively produced. It's just like an absolute diamond of production stuff. So, for example, all the samples alone, they bought so expensive samples. I can't believe they made any money off it after that. Like the Doors on Takeover, I think they got Jackson 5 in there. They got loads of huge names. So
there's a Bowie one on one of the tracks as well.
Right. So that's a style that polished nature of it that I wasn't as much in love with some other rappers like, say, Kendrick or whatever. But I'm no expert on this genre overall, and I did think it was generally really, really good. I think there was some really witty stuff in it as well, like the Right Said Fred reference. I thought was really good on that.
I couldn't believe that was in there.
Really, really good. So he's obviously really thought about it and really gone around the houses with his referencing and stuff, which I thought was really, really good. So I did enjoy it. I don't know that I agree about the Eminem reference, but then that's maybe just my bias against Eminem at the moment. We'll see what happens once we get to it.
You really need to get over that. Eminem's one of the best. I mean, he is one of the best MCs of all time. And his verse on this is incredible.
Yeah.
But anyway.
I don't know. We'll get to that right now. So I liked all of it, just about fairly consistently. Again, with the caveat that it was a little bit shiny sometimes for my liking. But I will say we've got to talk about Girls, 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 though, surely. I mean, we've talked about other albums, even in recent podcasts, where misogynistic shit was sort of spewed out by various musicians, and we've now got a song, Girls, 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 and we're not going to reference that in either of your comments.
I'm looking at it as it being of its time.
You can't say that about Neil Young, surely. That was like 30 years ago, 40 years ago.
He doesn't sing about... that's worse. A Man Needs a Maid is a more offensive song, if you ask me personally. I think you've got to look, and there's a lot of this talk about with hip-hop and with people's situations, and Neil Young is, there's no excuse for Neil Young to be making a song like that. Whereas, it's not great. It doesn't look great on him. I mean, I like the song as a song, but yeah, it's troubling lyrically to some respects. but also it's kind of it is of its time.
Yeah.
That was a lot of hip hop was making similar
Sure.
songs and statements.
Let's
at the
not
time,
go into a
which is
debate
not
about
great.
that versus Neil Young, but I'm just saying I think we can't really ignore that there's a song like that on this album that was problematic for me.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I agree. It's one of the harder songs to listen to now.
yeah.
But I think it's for me that is if we look back at Ready to Die when we did Biggie's Ready to Die as the classic, right? Some of the stuff on that is
Oh, that was off the fucking charts.
brutal, right? But you kind of can see, okay, that those songs are problematic and it does make it difficult, but also it is a thing that's in that genre and it's a thing that happens and it's happening less and less over time, which is obviously a brilliant thing. That it's getting better.
Yeah.
It still happens, but it is getting better. But I mean, it doesn't. I think. How old was Jay-Z when he did this album? Do you know, Matt?
Oh, I don't know. His debut was like 98, so 97, 96 maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to argue. Yeah, I'm not sitting here arguing that it's not misogyny.
I know what you're saying.
I just think it's kind of. It doesn't totally take away from everything.
Yeah, no, it doesn't completely ruin it. It just was a bit of a struggle for me whenever I heard that song. I was like, oh, I really want to skip
He
this
wasn't
one.
a young man.
Okay.
Let's put it that way.
Is it, Nick, because you wish you had that many girls everywhere? Is that the problem?
Actually, no.
No.
That's
jealousy.
That's not the reason. What a staggering response to the question. So yeah, not much else I want to say about it. Just overall, I'm glad we got into it, and I will actually listen to the Black Album now, which I haven't heard, on the basis of what you're saying. And in fact, I'll say that I'll definitely listen to it because last month you recommended that I listened to Childish Gambino's previous album, and it's fantastic. I've been going through it so much in the last month, so you've actually called it on that one, and therefore I trust you now to have recommended a Jay-Z album I should go to. So I will give you that credit.
To give you a warning, the Black Album, I'd say, is a step even into the more popular side.
Okay.
Further, it's more like The Takeover, and a lot of the songs that ended up on Collision Course are from the Black Album.
Okay.
So if you're familiar with Collision Course, you'll be familiar with the songs.
I'm not familiar with Collision Course.
I'm familiar with Collision Course.
Yeah.
That's my first. That was my first Jay experience as well, because I was into Linkin Park back in the day as well. So that was my first.
Good times.
Yeah, very sad.
Maybe we'll do a Linkin Park as a Why I Love.
Me and you could do a collaborative Linkin Park, and we could just do just.
I think maybe
just
I'm going to
in
be
the
ill
end.
that time. I don't think I'm going to be around. I'm going to be sick that month, I think, unfortunately. You have to run it on your own, unfortunately.
Let's just make a playlist entirely of the song In the End, Matt. We'll just put it on 23 times, and then we'll come and talk about that. I'd love that.
Oh my god. Yes, new metal is the worst. Let's just end on that note.
Do you know what?
I can't say it's the worst.
No, it was better than a lot of the crap you listened to in your teenage years.
You've no idea. You've no idea.
I actually think it encouraged a lot of men to talk about their emotions as well. So,
what do you mean? Like, are you talking about Papa Roach when you say that?
Yeah.
Cut my life into pieces. I am your last. This is my last resort.
I'm mostly thinking about Linkin Park.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, they have to scream it though, really macho, in a really macho way though, over really.
Do you know, sometimes when we do this, why I love it, I just want to do bands that I know Nick will hate just to put him through it. Like, I'm really, at some point, I'm going to do Oasis, even though I don't listen to them anymore, but I did love them.
Really?
Yeah, at some point I will have to do Oasis because I adored them. They were like my first big band. I now see the problems, but it'd be...
Well, I mean, this podcast does have a limited shelf life, doesn't it? So obviously that's going to be the end, isn't it? So yeah, you're going to kill it off at that point.
Yeah, I'll finish it.
Death knell.
All right, that's cool then. Yeah, so there we go.
We're all done. So next time, I guess we're going to be back again with a bunch of new albums. I am bringing to the table Run the Jewels with RTJ4 and LA Priest with Gene.
And I'll be doing Eve Toomer with Heaven to a Tortured Mind, and Medane with Cold Water.
Cool, and I'll be hosting, so my classic pick is Who is Jill Scott by Jill Scott, obviously. And the Why I Love, I'm going to do Tracy Chapman, and I'm just going to do her self-titled debut album.
Fantastic.
Cool.
That's great.
If you want to check out our website, it's pickiebees.com. You can check out my super cool article about Jay-Z and Linkin Park.
You can indeed. You might have to dig around for it. It's a while back, wasn't it? You have to dig around.
Yeah.
There's a search.
There is a search, yeah. Search new metal. It's probably the only article on there about new metal. And then there's obviously the Twitter, which is at I nearly said at Twitty Bastards then. At Picky Bastards, capital P, capital B, and the Facebook, which is at the Picky Bastards.
God, I want that Twitter account now.
At Twitty Bastards.
Twitty Bastards.
I'm going to call it. That's mine.
Okay, cool. Well, we'll see everyone soon.
See you
Thanks
soon.
very much. See ya.
Bye.